the message has been out there for about 12 years that psychedelics actually represent an opportunity for healing, an opportunity to return to religion as it was practiced before the invention of the marketplace. And I'm very pleased as I go around meeting people and discussing this issue to see how much of the youth culture has become sensitive to the psychedelic issue. Because it really means that after 20, 30 years of unstinting distortion and misrepresentation by the media and some of the powers that be, that nevertheless the curiosity is intact, the opportunity is available, and people have not been fooled by the effort to denigrate, dumb down, sideline, water down, sell out, whitewash, and screw over the idea that psychedelic plants are an excellent and necessary part of any program of spiritual self-exploration. I'm not going to talk that much about this today because I think it would be preaching to the converted. I'm not even going to remind you that our evolutionary heritage lies in the use of psychedelics, that it was in all probability psychedelics that called forth our humanness. I've talked about this in numerous forums. It doesn't have to be particularly gone over today. Since this is a hometown crowd, since this is peer review, I would rather go to some of the stuff that plays more with more resistance in Des Moines and Cleveland and beta test it here. While there's still time to recant. San Francisco is an incredibly forgiving town. If you need to go somewhere and make a mistake, this is probably the place. Anyway, after I've been altering my consciousness pharmacologically since I was 18, then trying to fold it back into the database of the culture to make sense of it mathematically, religiously, philosophically, historically, artistically, so forth and so on. And my conclusions become more and more radical. Last night in Sacramento, I lectured the psilocybin's impact on human evolution, and they quoted some anthropologist somewhere who wouldn't even give his name for the attribution of his no comment, saying it was too radical to even be considered. And I thought to myself, and the problem is, it's the most respectable idea I've got. Having given that its run for its money last night, what I'll talk to you about today, and then later we can have a question period, and it can be free-ranging, and whatever your concerns can come to the fore. But it occurs to me that science has very radically failed, and it's an unusual point to make, because we live in the impression that science is somehow at the pinnacle of its explanatory powers, and that it is going to give us clean air, better societies, safer sex, better entertainment, and ultimately some kind of explanation about how the universe really works. And in the past year, like happy kittens, they have dragged in and dropped on our doorstep the top quark, which is something to find out there in the bulrushes. If you didn't know to look for it, you probably would never find it. But nevertheless, for all of its capacity to razzle-dazzle, science has some serious drawbacks, some serious limitations that psychedelic experiences make more starkly evident, I think, simply because psychedelic people then compare the full spectrum of their experience to the paradigm they're being offered. For example, science proceeds probabilistically. This is how it's been doing its work for about 3 centuries. This involves an assumption that it has never been proven and is very, very difficult to test. It's the assumption that time is invariant. You see, probability theory rests on the idea of experiment. Science proceeds by experiment. But built into the concept of experiment is this very fishy notion called the restoration of initial conditions. And it turns out that there ain't no such creature. You can never restore initial conditions. A way of putting it is you can never go home again. Heraclitus said we never step into the same river twice. If you're paying attention, you might notice that means we never step into the same river once. Right? You see, science is a historical process that began with the Greeks and naturally dealt with the simpler questions first. And the simpler questions are, what is the world made of? How does it work? The complex questions are things like, what is language and how do we know truth? The Greeks sort of bridged that one. But they had this idea that because God was perfect, the universe should behave according to models of mathematical perfection. And so the planets were assumed to go in perfect circles, and the classical objects of Aristotelian geometry were made the basis of science. Now, one by one, over time, these perfect mathematical objects have had to be dumped and gotten rid of because they came into contradiction with observation. The difference between Ptolemaic astronomy and Copernican astronomy is that Ptolemaic astronomy does all its calculations with perfect circles within perfect circles. And what Copernicus said was, wouldn't it be simpler to use ellipses? And then you only have to use one ellipse rather than circles within circles within circles. But the leap of faith, or the leap of understanding that you have to make there, is the understanding that nature doesn't, the planets don't move in perfect circles. They're not gods. They're balls of rock obeying the laws of gravitation, keeping them in orbit. So one by one, these perfect objects of Greek mathematical explanation were abandoned. The sole exception is the idea that time is a perfectly smooth surface. This idea is very necessary to science because it means that measurements of physical systems are not time dependent. In other words, it would be counterintuitive to a scientist to be told, you will get a different charge for the electron if you measure it on Tuesdays and Thursdays than Mondays and Saturdays. They would say, that's preposterous. The charge of the electron must be invariant in time. Why? It's simply a first pass with the razor of simplicity. I mean, explanation should be as simple as possible, but no simpler, or you miss the point. So when we look at complex phenomenon, like the fall of empires, love affairs, corporate takeovers, social revolutions, these things never happen the same way twice. That's why we invented what we call the social sciences, meaning no science at all, but full of good intention. These kinds of complex phenomena are very critically dependent on initial conditions. You know, a love affair, between whom and whom, where, under what economic conditions, what were the religious preferences of the parties, and what did their parents think, and what did their children think? In other words, initial conditions set the course, and yet initial conditions are never the same in these complex systems. Science works very differently from ordinary perception. As you can see, if you walked around on the floor of this gathering, anomaly is highly prized here. If we have 1,000 people who go out on a starry night and see only the ordinary constellations, that is buried. But if one person goes out on a starry night and sees a rectangular black object a city block long with softly glowing yellow lights moving along the horizon, that's big news. Science works exactly the opposite. If you want, for example, to carry out a scientific observation, and you measure, let's say, the electrical charge running through a wire, and you measure it 1,000 times, and 999 times it's between 3 and 4 volts, but one time you get a measurement of 1,290 volts, a good scientist discards the aberrant measurement. Just says, well, that can't be right. That's ridiculous. Get that puppy out of there. Now average the other 999. Completely different way of doing intellectual business than the way it is done at the edge of human thought, where we seek the curious, the anomalous, the unusual, and then that leads us to wild generalizations backward against the pattern of normality, of normal happenstance. Okay, so this enslavement to Greek idealism of this particular sort has caused science to be fairly helpless in describing the kinds of complex systems that now more and more dominate our lives. Global economies, the internet, interlocking markets, so forth and so on. I want to suggest, it's a two-part suggestion, and this is the first part, that there is going to have to be a general revision of how science does its business if we want to actually extend the explanatory power of science into the domain of human social and intellectual complexity. And what science is going to have to do is recognize that, like everything else ever examined through the lens of science, time is going to have to be seen as some kind of variable phenomenon, something that is not a perfect mathematical plane, but has a topological texture at some level. It may appear smooth from a certain distance, but as your point of view sinks into it, this perfect smoothness is revealed to be, in fact, a composite of irregularities, that it is made of fractal subsets of itself. Now, science has led in this discovery of the fractal reordering of nature, but it hasn't extended it to time. The big news coming out of science in the last 10 years, perhaps the last certain truth that science will secure before its transformation, and it's a very important one, it's that nature is self-similar across scale. This is something that couldn't have been said even 10 years ago. Nature is self-similar across scale. This is big news, big understanding. And what does it mean? Well, it means, I'm sure you all have pondered the similarity between the structure of an atom, a galaxy, and a solar system. And if you inquired about this, you were told it's coincidence. Well, P.W. Bridgman is the person who pointed out that a coincidence is what you have left over when you apply a bad theory. You see? So, until 10 years ago, when you asked this question, you would be told it's a coincidence. It's easy to make a scientific revolution. I can remember when I was about 9, going to my mother in a state of high excitement and saying, have you noticed that South America will fit against Africa like a puzzle piece? And then we looked into it and we were told, this is a coincidence. Well, it wasn't 10 years before continental drift made a revolution out of the earth sciences by doing what? By recognizing what an 8-year-old child could point out, that Africa and South America were obviously once joined together. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to see this. You just have to have some experience with crossword puzzles and an open mind. So nature is self-similar across scales. That means that an atom is like a galaxy, is like a solar system, but it means more than that. It means that we can extrapolate toward cosmic processes by thinking about our own lives. Because our own lives are a tiny fractal piece of data that is part of a much larger, integrated, modular hierarchy that we now realize will have the same architectonic as our own immediate experience, except it will be expressed on a much larger scale. So that's the first and simplest part of this suggestion for a reformation of science that I want to propose. First of all, that this fractal principle be more clearly enunciated and understood. Everybody is talking about fractals, but it took Ralph Abraham to get it down to a bumper sticker for me. And it is. Nature is self-similar across scales. Companies explode the same way economies explode, the same way the biota of a continent explode. Processes are always similar, but only differ in scale. And what that means then is that our most immediate datum of experience, which is the feeling of being in a body, alive and feeling, can be extrapolated and mapped on to larger and smaller processes in the universe to give not only a sentient universe, a living universe, a dynamic universe, a universe with purpose, but it also gives us a universe with a very interesting set of closure properties that are different from the ones we learned from science. The thing about science and its cosmology is that it makes us irrelevant. We're told that we are an accident around an ordinary star, in an ordinary galaxy, in an ordinary portion of the local supercluster, and it's just ordinary, 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 nothing to be excited about. And then, you have existentialism, which says, well, then if you want to get excited, you have to admit that you're just doing it on your own hook. This is called conferring meaning rather than discovering meaning. We confer meaning, the existentialists tell us, and it's good as long as it lasts, and then that's nothing too. But all of these conclusions have been based on ignoring a second fact about nature that is as cogent as its fractality, and far more important for us, I believe. And this second factor is that the further back in time you go, the slower everything unfolds. Our present domain of experience is a domain of furious activity. I mean, many things go on this planet in a single day. There are inventions, there are books, there are transactions, there are meetings and dissolutions. We live in a busy world. As you journey backward in time, the world becomes less and less busy. And when you leave the domain of organic evolution, the world becomes boring as hell. And when you go further back to the period before even molecular chemistry, it's so boring one can barely compose a comment. So infused with ennui is the observer in the contemplation of the scene. But science has never inculcated this observation into its model of reality. We're told time is invariant. Therefore, this notion of speeding up or of complexity in some parts of time and not in others, it must be an artifact of observation. It must be an illusion or a mistake. It isn't real. But I maintain it is one of the most persistent facts about reality. And I've spoken of it here in terms of things get simpler as you go backward in time. We could stand that on its head and point out that things get more complex as you move forward in time. And that means that this moment is the most complex moment the universe has ever known, at least the local universe. That means, in a way, if the universe started at the Big Bang, it ends right here, right now, what I call local now, because the rest of time has not yet undergone the formality of occurring. So here we are, the inheritors of the Big Bang, standing in the ultra-complex local now. Now, what do I mean by complex? Well, on the platform of cellular evolution arose higher animals, complex ecosystems. On the platform of that arose early human culture. Upon that platform rose late human culture, including ourselves, including technology. My point here that I want to try to sell you on is that nature is a novelty conserving engine of some sort, that far from being a random process driven toward entropy by the second law of thermodynamics, nature is a process of complexification, that whenever this process is dealt a blow, it immediately sets out to recover and surpass whatever previous level of complexification it had attained. Well, now, the important thing about this, other than just its intrinsic importance for people doing philosophy, is that it holds out the possibility of a theory of ethics, because we are the most complex phenomenon that we know of on this planet. Now, there you may edge forward in your seat, ready to spring forward with some objection, but give me a moment here. Complexity is a tricky concept to define, first of all, to define mathematically or any other way. Norbert Wiener and some of those people spent some time on this. But intuitively, I think it's a pretty straightforward concept. The way I define complexity is density of connections. If point A has 16 connecting points, it is less complex than point B with 32 connecting points. That seems fairly clear. You would have an uphill battle to argue against that. Some weasel might, but who knows? I mean, hell, you can't get consensus on what time it is. But if nature is a novelty-conserving engine, if that's what nature treasures, then we are not the chance witnesses of an existential universe. We are, in fact, all God's children in some sense. In other words, we represent the quintessent gathering together of novelty. We are more than mere matter. We are more than mere biology. We are more than mere Aboriginal culture. We are all of those things, plus we are our technical, our skin of technical connections, our extruded culture, our fecal coral reef of transistors, resistors, transponders, databases, and transmission systems. All of that is superimposed on the organic. So suddenly, this message that has been relatively ignored by secular intellectuals for 500 years, the message of our importance in the divine plan gets a real leg up. The puzzle then is, if we're the part of the universe where value has come to rest in the process of compressing complexity, then why is it that in practical terms we seem like a loaded gun held at the head of the planet? In other words, all other systems and processes seem to have been put at risk to achieve this thin and wavering spire of complexification that threatens to come down around our ears at any moment and send us back to the 14th century, if not the Stone Age, if we mismanage ourselves. Well, I think that we need to look at this process from the broadest possible perspective and try to decondition ourselves from the assumptions of science. Every theory has what I call a hard swallow. I mean, because every theory is horseshit in some sense. You know? I mean, truth is known in silence. So if you're going out of that area, you should expect some rather peculiar blemishes on the enterprise. So every theory has a hard swallow. Science, their hard swallow, is what's called the Big Bang. The idea that the universe sprang from nothing for no reason whatsoever in a single moment. So notice that whether you find that persuasive or not, it is the limit test for credulity. Do you understand what I mean? I mean, if you will believe that, what would you dig in your heels on? I mean, if you would believe that, then my family has a bridge over the Hudson River that we are willing to let go for a song, and you could really get in on something good there. The Big Bang is completely improbable, utterly improbable. It is the most improbable of all improbabilities. So just remember that when the fascism of science is telling you that astrologers don't know what they're talking about and somebody else doesn't know what they're talking about. I mean, science has built a house of cards on worse than sand, quicksand. I would like to propose a completely different theory, which sounds, I know, far-fetched, but I think it answers certain problems that can't be reasonably dealt with otherwise. I would like to propose that the universe is headed toward a singularity. Not that it was born in a singularity and has been blasted outward with the unraveling of the laws of physics ever since, but rather the idea that the universe is not a purposeless explosion running down into entropy, but in fact the universe is some kind of process that is running along fairly well-defined runnels, or what the British biologist C.H. Waddington called creodes. In other words, it is not, again, it is not a flat surface over which we are free to lurch and careen in some kind of random walk or parody of Brownian motion. It isn't that at all. It is a topology. It is a surface, a slalom, whose high walls confine us as we move deeper and deeper into the process of complexification. And we move into that process faster and faster and faster. And this is where it gets woo-woo, because I am, willing to say I'm convinced, anyway. I'm willing to say I'm convinced that history is the enunciation of the nearby presence of a transformational event. In other words, a planet without history is what you get if it's business as usual. The chipmunks dig their burrows, the hummingbirds fertilize the nectar, the trumpet flowers, the ants dig out the ground. Everything proceeds normally. History is what happens when an animal species has its genome distorted by the nearby presence of a transcendental object. It only lasts 12 to 1,500 generations. It's very brief in terms of the life of this. If the life of this planet were a city block, history would be as thick as a piece of typing paper. That's how long it lasts. And yet, this is all we've ever known, the inside of this transitory domain called history. And without thinking about it very much, our secular society tells us to assume it will go on forever. Assume it will go on forever. That's a bigger stretch than the Big Bang for me. I cannot see how anyone could assume that human history will go on not forever, but let's say as long as it has gone on. Can anyone imagine the next 10,000 years of technological development and global civilization? It's a joke. Can anyone imagine the next 1,000 years or 100 years? I think that the asymptotic curve of technological development, complexification, the spread of communication technologies, and yada, 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 is happening so fast that within our lifetimes we can see the transcendental object rearing up and throwing the shadow of its enormous protean form across the surface of social processes and social evolution. History, the purpose of history is to create planetary crisis, and it's doing a splendid job of it. Apparently monkeys would rather kick back and chill, and so we only function well under pressure, and so the pressure is rising. And our responses have been astonishing. When the African continent dried up, we invented agriculture. When spoken language was insufficient, we invented alphabets. When they were insufficient, we invented mathematical modeling. When the complexity of the world exceeded our mathematical models, we built computational machinery to expand the power of our mathematical tools. We seem to function well under pressure, and now we are coming under pressure. Not this. This is not pressure. This is the long garden party before pressure, when people can still, worry about whether they're getting enough antioxidants and so forth and so on. Not to gore anyone's particular ox. I'm as concerned about antioxidants as the next person. But I think that for a very long time, maybe, I don't know, pick a number, but let's say 50,000 years, at least since language, shamans or users of hallucinogenic plants have had what Wordsworth called intimations of immortality. That aside from everything else which crowds the shamanic mind space, there is this view along the forward vector of time to this brilliant, boundary-dissolving light that seems to throw its influence across all processes that precede it. And religions, great religions that involve the faiths of hundreds of millions of people, are intimations of this transcendental object at the end of time. And they all get it wrong, of course. They get it wrong because it is always filtered through the vicissitudes of the historical moment and the political needs of those who are telling the tale. But if you take all of these things not as God's revealed truth, but more as God's image in the funhouse mirror of bent ideology, you can sort of extract out of all these images a sense of what the transcendental reality must be like. And I think, recurring to the idea that we are fractally organized, that we are microcosms of the larger structure of the universe, then I think in the natural phenomenon of orgasm and in the, how would you put it, the human-plant interaction occasioned by psychedelics, so orgasm and the psychedelic experience, we actually, in fractal form, anticipate this boundary-dissolving conclusion to the historical process. I mean, that's why Eros is like a compass of hope. Why everybody says, after the hortatory political breast beating and all of that, everyone knows that what we really need is love, that without that, it won't work. With that, the political, social, intellectual, and technological details will probably take care of themselves. But love, in the heart of a monkey, which is what we are, is an effort to image this transcendental thing at the end of time. I mean, to love is to open to the presence of the other. And that's a very, very profound boundary dissolution. Ultimately, at death, I think probably the only way you can meet death fully in command of your faculties is to love it, to surrender to it. Well, we each can make whatever peace we can or cannot make with our own death, but we get much more agitated when we contemplate the death of the species or the death of the planet, because that seems to involve such higher stakes, such greater loss. What I observe in nature is nature is a very high-stakes gambler. You know, nature is like the good shepherd in the gospel story. I mean, she will leave the 99 to save the one that is lost. Her interest in complexity and her willingness to allow it to adumbrate in ourselves to such excruciating levels is basically a willingness to put every gray whale, dandelion, parakeet, and spotted owl on notice that the human enterprise is somehow an acceptable risk for them to endure. And I think that the way psychedelics play into all of this is by being boundary dissolving, by being deconditioning agents, they strip from your eyes this downer trip that we have inherited out of a scientific model of reality. We are not lost in a mute, uncaring, purposeless universe. How anybody could ever suppose this? It takes an extraordinary power of the denial of simple observation to come to this conclusion. Nevertheless, this is what modern science tells us. If this isn't obvious to you, then you probably need to do 5 grams in silent darkness on an empty stomach and just weigh the various ideas that are being peddled in the intellectual marketplace. You know, Big Bang, God's love, transcendental object at the end of history. It's a small number of items on the menu.